Welcome to On the Line. I'm Christine Williams. Coming up, a look at Israel Apartheid Week and what it means for Israel. Stay tuned. Every year for the past 5 years, Israel Apartheid Week comes up around this time. It's a series of rallies and university drives that has spread to 40 cities globally. What it does is brand Israel as an apartheid state, one that is racist and oppressive to Palestinians and guilty of crimes against humanity. The campaign calls for divestments, boycotts, and sanctions against Israel. Some call it an unjust crime in itself to brand Israel this way and a threat to its very existence. Others say it's justified. Today, our focus is what this event means for Israel and the Jewish population, particularly on campuses. But we're also featuring a guest from the Palestinian Solidarity Network at the University of Alberta in support of Israel Apartheid Week. Let's meet our panelists. Avi Ben-Lolo is president and CEO of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. Rebecca Cherniak, president of McMaster University's Israel on Campus in Hamilton. Dr. Lawrence Hart, a medical doctor and chair of the Jewish Faculty Association at McMaster. And from our studio in Edmonton, Joel French, president of the Palestine Solidarity Network at the University of Alberta. Joel is also president of the Campus NDP. And for you watching, as always, our lines are open for you to call in at any time with your comments. Now, the question that we're asking you today, do you support Israel Apartheid Week? And if so, why do you? If you don't, we want to hear why as well. Once again, give us a call at any time. Thank you all so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Now, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with our guest out west. Can't hear him in the studio yet until I get that go-ahead there. So what we're going to do is start with our guests in the studio with us first to give you a bit of a highlight and understanding as to what Israel Apartheid Week is about. And I'm going to start with you on this one, Avi.
Well, to my knowledge, Israel Apartheid Week is a week that means to isolate and marginalize the state of Israel on university campus. It's a week where you have Palestinian activists, left-wing activists that are trying to identify Israel as an apartheid-like state. It's quite shameful, it's quite disturbing, it foments anti-Semitism and hatred towards Jewish students and spills over into the greater community with hate and intolerance.
Okay, now Dr. Hart, I'd like you to add to that. I mean, of course, Rebecca, we've got you on standby as well, and you're a student out at McMaster, but you're involved in this yourself, and from what I understand, the campus tends to be, or is, in fact, a very critical point of operation for Israel Apartheid Week. Tell us about it.
Well, it's the focus of Israel Apartheid Week. In fact, I don't even like to use the term Israel Apartheid as a term. It's a misnomer, it's a bogus term, it's a fallacy, it's slanderous. If one just looks at the notion of what apartheid is and what it isn't, apartheid as an entity of separation has a very time-specific and place-specific context, and that is South Africa. It was apartheid South Africa. And to then begin to extrapolate this to the local context and place it in juxtaposition with Israel and imply that there are similarities is completely bogus, and it should not even be used as a term. So when you have such an emotional term, which is then beginning to provide a focus to an entire week of events, you can imagine how much divisiveness and upset it causes on our campuses, which is the locale that frames the whole Israel Apartheid debate at this time of year.
Okay. Rebecca, let's hear your feedback on this.
My fear and the intimidation that's caused by this week is not that it's a week of academic events where we have a further understanding of what are the issues on the ground, but and I wouldn't call it pro-Palestinian, I'd call it very anti-Israel. I myself am pro-Palestinian. I want two states for two people. I want an end to the conflict, and I want to be informed, and I want to do programming that seeks paths that are leading to peace. Unfortunately, these programs that are hosted during this week are not in the name of peace. They are anti-Israel. They don't serve to enlighten anyone about what the issues are, and they're very toxic to our campus.
Okay, and once again, I said earlier that we were experiencing some technical difficulties with our guest in Edmonton, Joel French, the president of the Palestine Solidarity Network at the University of Alberta. Joel, I'm going to try you out there. Are you with us?
Hello?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you loud and clear, Joel. Welcome to our program.
Great. Thank
now,
you.
Joel, you heard what our guests have replied when it comes to this whole notion of, quote, Israel Apartheid Week. Now, obviously, you're supporting this. Let's hear why.
Well, I think it's best to start from a basis of defining what apartheid is, and one of your guests just gave somewhat of an idea of what that's about. But essentially what it's about is the separation of people based on ethnicity, and that's essentially what we have in the occupied Palestinian territories, which is the term for them used by the International Court of Justice. The occupied Palestinian territories are being inhabited by two different groups of people. We have the Israeli settlers who are living on what is under international law occupied Palestinian land, and we have the Palestinian people living on that land as well. And we have two very different systems of law applied to both peoples. There are separate roads for both. Palestinians are not allowed to travel on Israeli roads. We have checkpoints which Palestinians are forced to go through, which Israelis are not. And that is based on ethnicity. So if we're looking at apartheid as a word that has a definition of two different systems of law being applied to two different groups of people on the basis of ethnicity in one territory, I think the occupied Palestinian territories are obviously an example of that.
So Joel, you
now
believe...
your other guest.
Mm-hmm. Yep, go ahead. Go ahead.
Your other guest tried to basically say that Israeli Apartheid Week is an example of anti-Semitism. Now, I would challenge that guest to ask the Jewish members of our group and also the Jewish members of the global community why apartheid is being used as a word, because it's not just non-Jews such as myself that are using this word. It's Jewish people as well. It's people like Nev Gordon, an Israeli professor at Ben Gurion University, who is calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It's people like Benny Morris, a very conservative Israeli historian who uses the word apartheid. This is not a word that we just use on our campuses here in Canada and North America and in the West. This is a word that's being used around the world by non-Jews and Jews alike.
So Joel, you believe that racism is central to this cause?
I think there's no doubt I mean, the checkpoints that I mentioned are a perfect example of that. The Israelis, or the Jews, I should say, do not have to go through these checkpoints. If you are an Arab and you're going through the occupied territories, you are forced to go through a checkpoint and you're forced to wait in line.
Joel, how did you become involved in this particular movement?
I got involved when I got onto campus at the University of Alberta. I was interested in it already, and actually coming from an evangelical Christian background, I was even more aware than I think a lot of people around me of the differences between, in perceptions between what's actually going on in the Middle East and how we perceive it here in the West. And so I guess just the very difference, the shroud that covers it, really got me interested in the Israel-Palestine conflict, because there are so many misconceptions over here by people that just aren't asking the tough questions.
Okay, thanks, Joel. I would imagine that our guests here definitely want to respond to what they've just heard. And which one of you wants to go first? I'm seeing several nods here. Okay, go ahead, Avi.
Well, you know, there's a lot to respond to here, and I think the gentleman has to be better informed about who's saying what. Some of these Jews that he comments about as supporting the idea that Israel is an apartheid state can in and of themselves be anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean if you're Jewish that you can't be an anti-Semite or anti-Israel for that matter. Now, what you need to do is look around you. Just this past week at Queen's Park, we had a resolution where MPPs, in effect, said